They came from the sea. For 300 years, they came like waves of blood crashing against England's brittle shores. Monasteries burned, priests were gutted, whole villages disappeared into the fog behind longships and fire. The word Viking was not just a name, it was a warning, and then silence, until the year 1066, when the last sea king rose, not to plunder but to claim. His name was Harald Hardrada, forged in exile, raised by Byzantium, crowned in Norway. But what he sought was not gold. It was England's throne, and the only thing standing in his way was another man named Harald. History remembers the Battle of Hastings, the banners of Normandy, the bastard who burned his way into the crown. But long before that, before William's boots touched English soil, another war had already begun. And in that forgotten battle, a king died screaming with a spear through his throat, while another began to rot from the inside. This is not the story of conquest. It's not even the story of defeat. It is the story of a world that died without a funeral, a culture buried in blood, and a bridge soaked in the last breath of the Viking Age. Before England lost its soul to Normandy, it tore its spine apart to stop the North. And what rose from that bridge would haunt every crown that came after. Now step back, before the feast at Hastings, before the ashes at Senlac Hill. Step back to the banks of Stamford Bridge, where an empire ended without knowing it. Let's begin. England was not ready to die, but it was already bleeding. In the summer of 1066, the kingdom stood on a knife's edge. King Edward the Confessor was dead. His throne, still warm, became a prize. And like wolves drawn to carrion, they came, one from the north, one from the south, both claiming the crown, both believing it was theirs by blood, by fate, or by fire. And standing in the middle was Harald Godwinson, the last English king, barely crowned before the sky darkened with sails. But this is not his part of the story. This is about what rose in the north, Harald Hardrada. His name meant hard ruler, but that didn't begin to describe the man. He was no longer young, no longer pretty. The lines on his face were carved by war. His arms had held spears longer than most men lived, and in his chest beat the stubborn, ruthless heart of an age that refused to die. He had fought for gold, for emperors, for survival. But now, for the first time in decades, he fought for glory, not as a raider, but as a king claiming what he believed was his by right. He wasn't coming as a barbarian. He came wearing a crown. And yet behind the armor, something was already rotting, not just in Harald, but in the world he dragged behind him. The Viking dream, sail far, take all, die screaming, was no longer feared, no longer respected. The monks had walls now, the kings had armies, Europe had changed, but Harald hadn't. That was his strength, and it would be his curse. With him came Tostig Godwinson, Harald's own brother, exiled, bitter, boiling with hatred. He was no warlord, but he knew exactly where to aim the knife. He brought Harald not just an excuse to invade, but a map of the English soul. The names, the weaknesses, the roads unguarded, the hatred festering between lords. And with that, the last great Viking invasion set sail, not to raid, but to claim. They did not whisper when they arrived. They roared. Smoke curled behind them. Fear rippled ahead. York fell quickly, too quickly, as if England itself wanted to be punished. And while the South still stared across the Channel, fearing the bastard of Normandy, the true war had already begun. and no one was watching. But someone was listening. In the south, a king moved, tired, crowned in haste, but burning with the last energy his kingdom had left. He did not wait. He would not split. He would march through storm, sweat, and death to meet the north head-on. No rest, no sleep, just steel and fury and the growing silence before a slaughter. And what Harald brought with him was not strategy, it was vengeance. We move now to the shores of the Derwent, to the Viking camp at Stamford, where the dead had not yet risen, but soon would. They thought the north was theirs, until the bridge began to whisper. At Stamford, the Viking camp breathed like a beast at rest, bloated from conquest, drunk on blood, naked in arrogance. York had fallen, the English had bowed. The summer sun glared down on the invaders, but they did not fear the heat. They feared nothing. Why should they? The king of the north had come and shattered the defenders like dry bone. His men were giants. His name, Harald Hardrada, hung over the land like a shadow from the old sagas, long and dark and fatal. They believed the war was over, so they feasted. They laughed. Some swam in the river to cool their skin. Others lay bare-chested, armor abandoned, rations half-eaten, as if England had already become a memory. No scouts, no signals, no walls, only one command: rest. The next day, they would meet the hostages of York to secure their final surrender. A ceremony, a formality, a moment of pageantry before Harold took his place as England's rightful king. But the hostages never came. Instead, they heard something else, first like thunder, then like marching, then like fate. Across the ridge came the banners, and below them, tens of thousands of steel-tipped ghosts, moving fast, moving furious, silent in the kill. Harald Godwinson had arrived. His army had marched over 300 kilometers in just a handful of days. No sleep, no food, no hesitation. He brought not only soldiers, but survivors, men who knew their homeland was slipping through their fingers. Men who had nothing left but rage, and a king who demanded vengeance before the crown slipped further from his grasp. For the Vikings, it wasn't a battle, it was a reckoning. Their line cracked within moments. Some fought half-dressed, others died before they could reach their weapons. The river ran red within the hour. Harald, caught off guard, still managed to mount a counterattack with the half that had stayed armored, valiant, brutal, hopeless. But it was too late. The fire had come, not from behind the longships, but from the very land they thought they had conquered. And still there was the bridge, not wide enough for a full assault, not strong enough for retreat. Just one narrow spine of stone connecting death to delay, and on it stood one man. Now the story turns, not to kings, not to brothers, but to a nameless warrior with an axe and a promise that none would cross this bridge alive. One man held a kingdom at the edge of a blade. He did not have a name, not one the victors recorded, not one that echoed in ballads or bled into stained glass memory. But for a brief moment, between the roar of armies and the silence of death, he was a wall. A Viking warrior, stranded and alone, armed with nothing but his axe and the ancient fury of a dying world. He stood at the center of Stamford Bridge, blocking the only passage the Anglo-Saxon army could use to reach the main Viking force. And he did not move. Harold's men advanced, then stopped, not from confusion, but from awe. One man. Axe raised, blood already drying on his skin. Behind him, the river glistened. In front, the English surged like a tide, but still he held. The first challenger rushed him. He split him from collarbone to stomach. The second crushed under a sweep that rang across the stone. The third never rose again. 20, 30. No one knew how many died before the Saxons paused and stared at the man who refused to yield. He was not just a soldier. He was a wound refusing to heal, a final scream from an era that would not go quietly. Some say he fought for over an hour, others claim longer, that every man who dared step forward was repelled with bone-snapping precision. His axe danced in wide, brutal arcs, not elegant, not poetic, but final. And all the while, Harald Hardrada's camp scrambled to regroup on the far side, buying time with blood they hadn't earned. But every myth has its end. One English soldier, unseen, drifted beneath the bridge on a barrel, clutching a spear. He rose from the water like guilt and drove the blade upward, through the warrior's groin, tearing into his gut. The axe dropped. The man knelt. And the bridge opened. There was no cheer, no song, only the crossing, only boots on blood-slick stone, and the cold understanding that they were not just passing over a body, but over a memory. A last act of defiance now rotting in silence. The real slaughter was only beginning. Across the field, a king armed himself, not in time, not in confidence, but in desperation. Harald Hardrada, still breathing, still believing, gathered the armored half of his army. The oath he made that morning, to take England or die, was now no longer a promise. It was prophecy. The bridge was lost, but the blood had only just begun to speak. Harald Hardrada stood amidst the screams, no crown, no throne, no time, just iron, just death. The camp that had laughed that morning now twisted in agony. Those still armored were few, scattered like ribs from a broken carcass. The rest, dead, dying, or running barefoot across a battlefield they had thought would be ceremonial. He didn't run. They say he strapped on his mail with bare hands still wet with command. No royal procession. No horn blast, just the old way, shoulder to shoulder, sword drawn, eyes locked not on survival, but on ending the fight the way a Viking king was meant to. Standing tall, roaring and feared, and for a brief, violent breath, it worked. His armored warriors rallied around him, forming a shield wall that bit and screamed with steel. They slammed into Harald's advancing line with the force of cornered wolves, cutting deep, pushing back, making the English blade for every inch. It wasn't order, it was fury. And at the center of it all, Harald raged, axe in hand, towering like some ghost of Valhalla itself, dragging death down with each swing. But fury doesn't outlive exhaustion. Not in open fields, not under a foreign sun. The English had numbers, momentum, terrain, and the taste of vengeance thick in their mouths. What began as a counterattack became a death spiral. One by one, Harald's men fell. Their formation broke. Their shield wall shattered. There were no replacements, no reinforcements, no longships to retreat to, only grass, mud, and blood. Then the arrow came. They say it hissed like a curse. No one knew who loosed it. Perhaps it wasn't even aimed. But it found its mark, piercing Harald through the throat. He did not fall immediately. He dropped the axe, grasped his neck, and staggered forward as if willing his body to hold longer than history would allow. But the rage faded. The last Viking king collapsed into the mud, eyes still open, mouth still silent, not from cowardice, but because there were no more words left for this world. Harald Hardrada died like the world he came from, loud, sudden, and then forgotten, but not everyone on that field had fallen. One still remained, one who had bled Harald's name for years, one who did not scream when the arrow struck, but clenched his teeth and drew his own sword. His name was Tostig, and the next death would be personal. Some betrayals don't echo, they just bleed. Tostig Godwinson did not weep when Harald fell. He did not shout or run or curse the gods. He stood amid the wreckage, amid the shattered blades and burning flesh, and gripped his sword tighter, as if he still believed there was something left to win. But there was. The dream had already died with the arrow. The crown would never be his. England would never forgive him. And the brother he had tried to destroy was now marching toward him with the cold weight of justice on every bootstep. Once they had shared blood, the same house, the same father, but Tostig had broken that line, exiled from his own land, stripped of his title, humiliated by the very people he thought he ruled. And when Harald took the throne, Tostig didn't see a brother crowned. He saw a thief, a traitor to their name, a man who left him behind. So he chose another king. He crossed the sea, took up arms beside the last Viking warlord in Europe, and pointed him directly at England's heart, not for honor, not even for power, but for revenge. Revenge so bitter it soured even the blood that once bound them. But now, standing on that battlefield, with Harald's corpse cooling beside him, there was no brotherhood left to twist, only reckoning. The Anglo-Saxon line closed in. Some say Tostig tried to rally the last of the Norwegians, screaming orders through blood-choked air. Others claim he dropped his shield, stared into the tide, and welcomed what came next. Either way, he was cut down, not with ceremony, not with warning, just one sword through the ribs, the way all traitors end. His name, like his loyalty, was buried where he fell. And Harald Godwinson, he didn't speak his brother's name again, not that day, not ever. The man he remembered had died long before Stamford Bridge. The one lying in the mud was just a shadow that finally stopped moving. But Harald had no time to mourn, no space to breathe. The battle was not over. The riverbank still writhed with men who hadn't yet accepted their death. And among the carnage, a silence began to form, a silence deeper than fear, because the Vikings were about to realize something they hadn't faced in centuries. No one was coming to save them. Not every death makes noise, some just erase a future. The Vikings did not break all at once. It happened slowly, like something ancient realizing it could bleed. After the fall of Harald and the butchering of Tostig, the battlefield changed. The screams dulled, the resistance softened, and in the eyes of the Northmen still clutching their weapons, something fractured. The fire that had brought them across the sea, the dream of a new kingdom, a final conquest, one last saga, dimmed beneath the weight of reality. They were no longer warriors of fear. They were outnumbered men surrounded by a homeland that refused to kneel. Some tried to flee. Others fought to the end, not for victory, but because they didn't know how to stop. Bodies piled at the banks, piled in the mud, piled beneath the collapsing sky. The Derwent River ran black where the blood mixed with ash. No songs were sung, no last stands remembered. The shield wall that had once terrified continents crumbled into wet soil. And still, Harald gave no pause. He didn't offer mercy. He didn't negotiate. What he had marched across England to do, he did with brutal precision. He crushed them, not just the men, but the memory. He shattered the idea that Vikings could still rule by fear. What they had come to reclaim, they left behind in pieces. Swords, banners, bodies. And with each silent fall, the age that had once set Europe on fire flickered and died. Out of the nearly 300 ships that had brought Harald's army across the sea, only 24 limped back to Norway. Most were empty. Most carried no gold, only corpses. There was no ceremony, no pyres, no Valkyries, just wind over a quiet field and the buzz of flies where kings had fallen. But even in that silence, even in the wreckage, something darker stirred, because Harald Godwinson had paid dearly for this victory. Too dearly. And while one enemy died in the north, another was already watching from the south. And that one had not come alone. Victory can rot faster than defeat, especially when it marches on broken legs. Harald Godwinson had won, but what stood beside him after Stamford Bridge wasn't an army, it was a grave procession still wearing armor. His best men were dead. His captains were maimed. His horses had collapsed on the road back, and the soldiers who had marched across England, fought in full heat, and butchered the last Vikings by hand, were no longer men. They were husks held together by rage, sweat, and the thinning thread of duty. The king didn't smile, he didn't rest, he turned south, because he knew, even before the scouts reached him, even before the messengers gasped out the words, even before the wind shifted direction, he knew. William of Normandy had landed. While Harold had been fighting ghosts from the past, the future had invaded. And this time, it didn't come howling with axes or roaring in pagan fury. It came with banners sanctioned by the Pope. It came with knights trained to kill kings. It came with war machines, cavalry, propaganda, and bloodlines soaked in calculation. Harold had no time, not to mourn, not to regroup, not to breathe. He turned his bruised army around and forced them back toward the coast. The same men who had just survived the Viking apocalypse now limped toward a second storm, one colder, cleaner, and far more permanent. There would be no fresh recruits, no months to rebuild, only days, maybe less. What he carried with him wasn't momentum, it was drain. Stamford Bridge had bought England a moment of pride. But pride weighs heavy when your legs no longer move. And every step south was not just a retreat from exhaustion, it was a walk toward the real execution ground. Because what Harold didn't know yet was that Hastings wouldn't take his kingdom, it would take his face, his body, his name, and burn them into history's nightmare. But before that nightmare began, there was still the cost to count. The cost of this so-called victory. The Viking Age had died, but something else had died with it. Something Harold would never get back. Something England never recovered from. Sometimes, a victory is just the sound of your kingdom dying slower. The slaughter at Stamford Bridge had ended the Viking threat, but it hadn't saved England, it had bled it. The price of that win was written not in gold or songs, but in the silence that followed Harold's footsteps south. Villages watched him pass, but didn't cheer. They saw the truth in the eyes of his soldiers. These weren't defenders anymore. They were spent offerings, burnt men walking, the shell of a force that had already paid too much for a crown no one could hold. And across the channel, William watched. He knew the battle in the north had drained Harold dry. He knew the King of England had burned his reserves before the real war began. William didn't need to conquer an empire, he just needed to step over a tired one. He had time, he had the Pope's blessing, he had the winds. And he had something Harald didn't, a fresh army that hadn't tasted blood yet. But worse than the soldiers or the swords was the story. Because Harald's great victory at Stamford Bridge would never inspire the kingdom, it would cripple it. Lords who once admired him now questioned his judgment. Why had he marched his entire army north? Why had he left the southern coast exposed? Why had he won a battle that solved nothing? The north had been saved. But the heart of England was exposed, and no amount of heroism could patch what had already cracked. Harald had stopped an invasion, but in doing so, he ensured the next one would be fatal. He didn't just weaken his army, he revealed his pattern. A king who would answer every threat himself, a man who could be baited. And William, watching from Normandy, sharpened not just his blade, but his timing. Because what Harald didn't know was that Stamford Bridge wasn't the end of something. It was the opening move in a much longer game. One where the death of the Viking Age would mean nothing, because what came next would tear out England's soul. But before the soul is taken, the body must fall, and one final chapter still had to close. A kingdom can lose its army, but when it loses its memory, it's already gone. The Battle of Stamford Bridge did not vanish because it was small. It vanished because it was inconvenient. It didn't fit the story England wanted to tell. It wasn't clean. It wasn't victorious in the way that mattered. It was a bloodbath that saved nothing. A high, brutal crescendo that collapsed into silence weeks later on the fields of Hastings. And so, history looked away. No statues, no shrines, no cathedral bells, just a quiet bridge and the ghosts no one dared to name. But this was not just the death of men. It was the death of an entire world. The Viking Age, which had once carved fear into the bones of Europe, ended not in glory, but in confusion. There was no last raid, no heroic funeral. Only rotting armor in English soil and 24 ships limping back to Norway, dragging with them the end of an era. An age that began with burning monasteries and screaming monks now finished under a grey sky, unmarked and uncelebrated. The longships had crossed the sea for conquest. They returned with silence. Harald Hardrada's name would live on, but not as a king who claimed England, as a ghost, a warning, a final roar swallowed mid-breath. And England, for all its pain, did not heal, it hardened. The blood Harald spilled to stop the North left his kingdom brittle, cracked beneath the weight of its own effort. The men who marched with him were gone. The strength that had made Wessex unbreakable had been spent on a bridge no one would remember. What fell at Stamford was not just a Viking king, it was a mirror, one last reflection of what England once was and what it would never be again. Because in just days, the next army would arrive, not with beards and axes, but with banners and Latin crosses, and they wouldn't ask for surrender. They would take everything, including the crown that had already been paid for in blood. Some battles don't end, they just change masks. Stamford Bridge was not the end of the Viking threat. It was the beginning of something colder, something sharper. That day, the last axe fell, but not before slicing England open wide enough for the next invader to walk straight through. Harald Godwinson stood on that blood-washed field as a victor, but beneath his boots, the soil didn't cheer, it groaned. It absorbed the weight of what had just been lost, not just men, not just breath, but time. 3 centuries of war with the North had forged a kingdom on instinct, fast, brutal, reactive. But now, the Viking was gone, and the void he left wasn't peace, it was exposure. The victory had no crown, no reward, no relief. Just decay. By the time Harald turned south, he wasn't marching with an army, he was dragging a corpse-wearing chainmail. The best of England had died facing the past. The rest would now die facing the future. Harald Hardrada was buried in foreign dirt, his legacy fading faster than the blood on his blade. No sagas finished his story, no sons rose to avenge him. He was the last, not just of a bloodline, but of a world. And Harald had won, but winning had cost him the very thing he was trying to defend, not land, not title, but time, the time to prepare, the time to recover, the time to remember who he was before he became a weapon used against himself. Stamford Bridge was not a turning point, it was a trap, a final echo of a dying era, loud enough to distract, long enough to cripple, deep enough to bury what little strength England had left. When the Normans arrived, they didn't conquer a kingdom, they collected a corpse, and for centuries afterward, the silence would hold. Because no king likes to remember the day he won too well and lost everything after, but we remember. Because the men who died on that bridge didn't just fall for Harald, or for England, or for glory. They fell for a world that no longer had a place for them, and they fell alone. And so the bridge is quiet now. No banners, no blood, just stone and wind, and a silence thick enough to bury kings. Stamford Bridge ended the Viking Age, but it also marked the last time England would ever fight on its own terms. What came after wasn't defense, it was desperation. One king fell in the north, another in the south, and by the time the crown stopped rolling, England didn't belong to itself anymore. But history doesn't rest, it marches. Sometimes in iron boots, sometimes in funeral cloaks, and whether the next path leads deeper into the haunted forests of Europe, or back across the sea where longships once burned holes through the mist, one thing is certain, blood remembers. So if you haven't met the last English king, Harald Godwinson, you should see what happened when he faced the bastard of Normandy. And if you're ready to hoist the sails and follow the echo of axes, the Viking dead are waiting. Your march continues. Choose your direction, the last English king, the bastard who burned England, the rise of the last Viking. Subscribe, the ghosts don't stay buried.